Well, good morning. I'm glad you are with us. The Humanities Social Sciences Division, the Humanities Enrichment Series, and Student Life and Engagement are happy to have with us today Richard Stone, our speaker from the Pulitzer Center. The Pulitzer Center is a media organization that grants journalists the opportunity to travel all around the world to report on various issues. So for the Pulitzer Center, Rich traveled to Iran to report on the lingering effects of nerve agents used by the Iraqis during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. In order to write the story, he met with both victims and their physicians in order to gather his material. And in addition to his work with the Pulitzer Center, Rich works for Science magazine and has contributed to other known publications such as National Geographic and the Smithsonian. So his work has taken him to many areas of the world, including the UK, China, and North Korea. Six times?
Six times.
Six times to North Korea.
one more time next week.
One more, and he's leaving again to go to North Korea next week. So we are thrilled to have Rich with us today. I've been able to spend a lot of time with him the last few days, and he's been a lot of fun to hang around with, so hopefully he can say the same for us. So anyway, I'll hand it over now, because that's what you're really here to listen to.
Good morning, everybody. I bet you didn't know there was a direct flight from Winston-Salem to Pyongyang, right? Okay, there isn't. I'm going back to Washington, then I'm flying to Beijing and on to Pyongyang next week. But I'm here basically to talk about Iran, my experiences reporting there, and I've had a great couple days here at Forsyth, meeting with students, talking about reporting experiences and strange places, life as a journalist. And after the talk, happy to answer any questions you might have about that. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on Iran, which was the subject of my trip last October, funded by the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, to learn about nerve agent victims, Iranian chemical weapons victims from the war there 30 years ago. I'll focus on that reporting experience. But before I get to that, I want to give you a general picture of Iran and some of the journalistic challenges of reporting there. Iran is a pretty varied topography, but one thing that is kind of a problem throughout the entire country is lack of water. So water resources are quite limited, and water management has been pretty poor. So one of the big issues in Iran these days is the environment. And a couple of years ago, I had a chance to visit northwestern Iran, where a huge lake, about the size of the Great Salt Lake here in the US, was dying. The lake is dying. It had lost about 90% of its volume over the past 10 years. And this is what it looks like in 2015, and basically what it looks like today as well. It's just this little tiny remnant of a lake, extremely salty. You see some Iranians bathing in the lake because they feel the salt water is good for their health. But it's an ecological tragedy because all the life in the lake, the fish, even little brine shrimp, which thrive in salty conditions, it's too salty for them. So all the life in the lake is gone. This is what it looks like now, and you think this is a picture from the Arctic Ocean, right? It looks like a big ice sheet and a guy going out maybe to do some ice fishing. In fact, this is just salty remnants of the lake. Most of it, like I say, has evaporated. Another part of the lake, it's desert conditions now. This looks like just a sand dune, and that's what it is. But 15 years ago, this was the northern part of the lake. Another big issue that a lot of people are probably familiar with in Iran, about Iran, is the nuclear program that they have there. 3 years ago, the US government and European countries joined together, and Russia, China, to have a deal with Iran to limit their nuclear program. It's the Iranian nuclear agreement, which I think has been in the news. I'm sure you've seen the news stories lately that the Trump administration is quite unhappy with the deal and wants to end it. But this deal 3 years ago was put in place to try to restrict Iran's activities in the nuclear area. It limited their ability to enrich uranium. So that's pretty important because enriched uranium is what's used to make a nuclear bomb. So I'm a science journalist, but nuclear science is considered one of the topics that our readership is interested in. So I had a chance to go to Iran in 2016 to report on Iran's nuclear program. So this was a year after the agreement had been reached and what was being done in Iran to abide by the agreement, and also what Iranian nuclear scientists actually do. So that's something that, as a science journalist, you see a lot of political coverage of events, a lot of political coverage of the Iran nuclear agreement, what that means for both countries. But, of course, the newspapers or whoever, they don't focus on the scientists themselves. What were the Iranian nuclear scientists doing? So this person here, he's the president of the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization, and his organization has several thousand scientists. It's a huge number of people, and the deal essentially forced them to go into a more strictly peaceful area of research. So they were doing research on nuclear fusion, for example, how to create energy from fusion, which is different from fission, which is what happens when a nuclear bomb explodes. It's a very interesting background, too, because some years ago, probably Israel and the United States, although both countries always never acknowledged that they were behind this, there was a campaign to assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists. And so in the office of the president, he had these pictures on the wall of 5 Iranian nuclear scientists who had been assassinated as part of this campaign. And it's interesting because from perspective of United States and Israel, the idea was to slow the Iranian nuclear program, to create obstacles to it by taking out key nuclear scientists. But from the Iranian perspective, they have just a different view, and they, I guess it can be traced to Islam, in that they view that there is an afterlife and that the scientists were martyred. So they gave up their lives for the cause. And instead of what we expected in the West, this is a cultural difference, we expected that this would kind of make Iranian nuclear scientists scared of coming to work, or young scientists going into nuclear science because they felt they might be targets. In fact, it had the opposite effect in Iran. I mean, it created more interest in trying to develop this field for the country. So in that sense, it was counterproductive from the US and Israeli point of view. So I've written about the Iranian nuclear program, and I wanted to touch on one other aspect before going to chemical weapons. And it's something that, there's so many interesting facts about countries and concepts and ideas that it's just hard to find any information about here in the United States. So, I travel to North Korea, and when I go there, I see things no one else has seen, Western reporters, and I'm able to tell a fresh story. Even in a place like Iran, which has open internet access, unlike North Korea, there are aspects of the country that I'd never heard about, people here never hear about. And one, it's this desert in southeastern Iran. It's called the Lut Desert. It is the hottest spot on the planet. So they measured a record temperature in the shade of 174 degrees, something like that. I mean, can you imagine in the shade it's that hot? That itself is pretty remarkable. It's like an interesting fact, a factoid. But what's really remarkable about this desert is that you would think that in these conditions, like oven-like conditions, that it would be sterile. I mean, there's practically no water there, that there'd be no life whatsoever. In fact, there is an unusual ecosystem there. And the ecosystem is sustained by migratory birds that try to cross the desert. And it's so hot, a lot of the birds kind of go into these canyons and these hills, and they try to rest in the shade. But I just told you what the shade temperature is. You know, if we rest in the shade after a few hours without access to water, we would die. And the birds die too. And sometimes birds just drop out of the sky because of the heat radiating up from the desert. And the birds, these dead birds, are the base of the ecosystem. So, you know, food webs, like at the base of a food web, are either microbial life or plant life, and then you go up the food pyramid, up to predators at the top, humans at the top. But here in the Lut Desert, the base of the food web are these dead migratory birds. And so you have all this insect life. You have snakes and desert foxes, all surviving on the migratory birds. Now, it's fascinating. And unfortunately, like in today's news, so much of the news is skewed toward topics that, you know, are probably more relevant to our daily lives. But, you know, it's the same thing over and over. You know, latest from the Trump administration, or what's going on in the NCAA tournament, or whatever. You know, news that is kind of exclusively of interest to us, to our, relevant to our daily lives. But there's a lot of fascinating information that is not covered, for the most part, in the news, and you can't even find this on the internet unless you really know what you're looking for. But these stories are out there, and part of a job of a journalist is to really find new stories that are worth telling. So I'm getting closer to talking about the chemical weapons. This was my most recent trip to Iran that the Pulitzer Center had funded. And the main purpose was to report on the nerve agents and what they did to the Iranian people. But I also visited eastern Iran to another area that is an ecological disaster zone. So there used to be a wonderful wetlands area, an oasis, where for thousands of years, travelers from Asia coming to Europe would stop here and rest their camels, you know, get water, get food. This oasis is a site of one of the oldest religions in the world, the Zoroastrians. They had a temple in this area, and so it's a very special place. And recently, the river that would feed this wetlands was coming from Afghanistan. And this is the Iranian-Afghan border. And you see the river is just like a sandy bed right now. There's no water there. Because of two reasons. One, less water coming from Afghanistan, and water mismanagement inside Iran. The wetlands are gone. They've just completely disappeared. So it's a huge loss. It's not far from the Lut Desert, so you know what kind of the overall environment is like. And to lose this little oasis that was really the only source of water for life in a pretty big geographic area was a huge loss. So I went with some rangers from the province, and they took me to this village near where the wetlands used to be, on the edge of a former lake. And the village was almost completely abandoned. So most people were forced to migrate. A lot of people made their living fishing or growing crops thanks to irrigation from the wetlands. So the village was entirely empty except for one family. They were there basically hoping that the water would come back someday. They weren't ready to give up living in this area. But it was pretty, desperate situation. So here on the left, I'm petting this little lamb. They were raising sheep, and we had a little barbecue there because we stopped there for lunch when we went to the site where the wetlands used to be. There's nothing there. I mean, this whole region, this is the only place we could eat some food. Everybody else had left. There was no Kentucky Fried Chicken or McDonald's or anything. There's nothing in the area. So we had a little picnic inside this abandoned villages. These are the rangers who I went with on the trip. It was quite an experience, but sad at the same time, because you knew that this way of life in that region was doomed. That these people, they were still kind of holding on to hope that the water would come back, but the chance of that happening was so remote that it seemed almost hopeless for them. Well, so now I'm going to turn to chemical weapons, and this was the main object of my trip. These chemical weapons were used in the war between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s. It was a long war. It lasted 8 years. And hundreds of thousands of people died. And it was really just a brutal war. Like, both sides, most of the able-bodied men were killed in the war by the middle of the war. So in the last few years of the war, it was mostly teenage boys who were going to the front lines. So it was awful. A lot of teenagers died in the war, and what really stood out as particularly horrific was the use of chemical weapons. So this is an image from actually an Iraqi village. So Saddam Hussein had the chemical weapons, and he used them mostly on Iran, on Iranian soldiers and Iranian civilians. He would bomb Iranian villages. But he even used it on his own people, Kurdish people. And this was an attack using nerve gas in this place called Halabja in 1988, toward the end of the war. You just see people lying on the streets. They were exposed to a nerve agent. It can kill you in seconds. And so that happened during the war. Like I said, this war took place, it ended 30 years ago. So it's pretty, almost like, to us, it's ancient history, right? I mean, we had the Gulf War in 1991, and that seems like a really long time ago. You don't see anything related to the Gulf War either in the news or on billboards on the streets in the United States. Of course not. You don't see that. But in Iran, you see lots of memorials to this war with Iraq, and still like posters on the streets. This is a highway overpass, and it shows basically portraits of heroes from the Iran-Iraq War. It's such a big scar in the national psyche of Iran, and they still venerate these people who died in the war, and they still grieve over it, because you can imagine just about every family was affected, and a lot of them lost like young sons in the war. So it still, it still haunts them today. And what I was doing, the purpose of my trip, I should actually step back and tell you why I decided to do the story, because it's old news, right? I mean, the war happened 30 years ago, so why would I even be interested in writing about the Iran-Iraq War? I've written a bit on Iran, on the other topics, as you know, and I just came across a reference to a scientific study of the survivors of the chemical weapons attacks. And that in itself wasn't kind of sensational enough to really justify writing a story, but what intrigued me was that there were so many people who had survived the war, who were victims of the war, who were still alive and being studied by the scientists. So it's tens of thousands of people. And I thought, well, this is pretty unique because previously, before this war, the last time chemical weapons were used on such a scale was in World War I. So World War I, many, many people died from exposure to chemical weapons, and the survivors were studied, but not with the modern tools of science that we have today. So I thought there must be pretty interesting insights that were being made in such a large population. And that was essentially the justification for me doing the story now, because I realized that a lot of these survivors, they're starting to get, they're older, much older. The chemical weapons have a pretty harsh long-term effect on people, so people were dying. And this population of victims was going to be lost at some point. And I wanted to chronicle what they were going through now while they were still alive, talk to the survivors while they're still alive, talk to the scientists who were working with them, who were studying them. So that was the justification for me going to Iran. And I mentioned for the Loot Desert, like you try to go online, you try to find information about that, and there's not much out there. And the same thing with the chemical weapons victims. There's not much information out there. So I realized I'd have to go to Iran and report the story. So how would somebody go about, a journalist go about telling this kind of story? What would be interesting for a reader, any kind of reader, whether it be a scientist or a member of the general public? And what would be most interesting are the stories of people, of the victims themselves, what they went through, describing what it was like to be exposed to these horrendous chemical weapons, what it was like on the battlefield or in a village that was attacked. That's one clear kind of gripping personal story, compelling personal story that would help any storyteller, because you can relate when someone is telling their own experiences. It's a lot more interesting than, say, describing how the chemical weapons affect cells in the body. Maybe to a scientist, that's kind of the crux of the issue. That's what they're trying to understand. But to a reader who's coming at this fresh for the first time, they want to know what it was like to experience this. And obviously, this happened 30 years ago. I can't go to the scene of an attack and describe, like you saw the image of the bodies lying on the street in Halabja. I can't go to the scene of an attack and describe what I see. I can't interview victims who are, still suffering from the immediate effects of the chemical weapons. I have to tell a story where they go back and talk about their memories of what happened. And that's actually not easy, not an easy assignment. And the reason is, over time, a lot of people forget the details. They'll say, oh yeah, I was on a battlefield, and we all had gas masks, and then the bombs fell, and then some people got sick. They'll talk about it in very vague terms. And you realize that, of course, it was very traumatic for them. And oftentimes it's pretty traumatic for them to even recall it today. But as a journalist, you're missing the vivid details that can really paint a picture for the reader. Because for me as a print journalist, that's my assignment. When I go back to my desk later after I've done all my reporting, what kind of story can I tell, and how am I going to tell the story? I want to paint a vivid picture of the scene, but if the victims I'm talking to have very hazy memory, it's challenging. And really the only way to overcome that challenge, I can't invent facts, I can't invent what it was like, I can't fill in details that are missing myself. The only way to do it is to talk to as many people as possible and, take the most vivid recollections and use those. So I talked to, for this story, I talked to about maybe 15 victims of chemical weapons. I talked to a few scientists who were on the battlefield themselves. And of these 18, 20 stories that I heard, maybe 15 or 16 I couldn't even use because it was just too vague. Sure, I understood that the people suffered, for sure. And I could include them in the story because I could talk about currently, what they're currently dealing with, like the health effects that they're suffering from now. But I couldn't have them bring the reader back to what it was like on the battlefield at the time, except for a few individuals who had really, vivid, detail-rich recollections that they could share, including this guy on the left. And he had kind of the right ingredients to make an even more powerful story, especially for readers of Science magazine, many of them who are scientists. So his name is Dr. Ahmadi, and that's a picture of him on the top left during the war. So he was 18 years old, fighting in the war. And he told me the story about how he was transporting some soldiers who were exposed to mustard gas, which is a really terrible chemical that damages your lungs and creates huge blisters on the skin. He was telling me a story about how he had brought them to a field hospital, how, describing vividly what the soldiers who were affected were going through. And so he could tell me, he could really paint a picture of the scene in my mind, and I could be able to convey that to the reader myself. But what was really even more kind of impactful in writing about him was that it changed his life for the better. He witnessed these atrocities, but then, and he felt so helpless because he couldn't do anything for the victims that he was bringing to the field hospital. But it made him think that he had to go study medicine because he wanted to make up for the fact that he couldn't help these people. He eventually became a dermatologist, and now he studies the victims of the chemical weapons. So he dedicated his life to understanding how to help these victims as a result of the trauma he experienced on the battlefield. So I didn't know his story before going to Iran. I had his name as somebody who studied chemical weapons victims. That's all I had. I didn't know any of his personal story. The only way I would have discovered him and brought his story to our readers was by being there and by talking to people. And that's kind of the fundamental nature of good journalism, is being willing to just get out there and spend time talking to as many people as possible, because you're not going to find a lot of good information sitting at your computer or even calling people on the phone. A lot of times you just got to get out there and hustle and just, realizing that 95% of the information you gather, you probably can't even use for the story. In fact, when I work with young journalists, and I do occasionally do workshops, one of the kind of the biggest challenges to overcome, and I was the same way when I was young, is you think that as a young person, as a young journalist, your opinion matters. What you think about a story matters, and in fact, it doesn't. Unless you're like a commentator writing opinion pieces for the editorial page of the New York Times or Washington Post, their opinions matter. But even a journalist like me, my opinion doesn't matter about chemical weapons. I'm being objective. I'm just gathering information and opinions from other people who experience this. So a lot of young journalists, when they start writing, they'll have a topic assigned to them or a topic in mind. They'll have an opinion already about it, and they'll try to search for some information that kind of supports how they already think about something. So part of the job of developing as a writer, and I shouldn't say this is limited to journalists. It should be applicable to any kind of writing where you are trying to explain something or make a point or whatever. You are trying to document it, and you should always go in with an open mind. And of course, that's what I strive for myself, is to tell the story through other people's eyes, through their own voices. Basically, I'm channeling them. I'm allowing them to use me to tell their stories, and I'm trying to be as faithful to the truth as I possibly can be. Anytime a journalist writes a story, you are limited in time. You have a deadline of some sort. At some point, even if you don't have a deadline, at some point you have to say, I've done my best to collect the information that's available, and this is what I have. I personally, I'm always uncomfortable when I have to just like call it and say, okay, I've done all I could to report the story. It can be very frustrating sometimes because I always feel like there's someone else I could have talked to, or some information that I think is still missing. I don't know how to get it. I hate reaching that point. It was true for the chemical weapons. I had 1 week in Iran. I have to talk to as many people as I can. And I'm talking to these victims. In fact, I'm talking to a lot of victims at a hospital. And I'm frustrated because people can't remember. And part of me says, oh, come on, try to remember. You know, I'm thinking that in my mind. Don't you know any details of what it was like? I mean, I was trying to kind of lead them to describe the scene of the battlefield or so forth. But, you know, they just don't remember, really. It's just like a vague memory. And I think it's part of the trauma of experiencing that is the brain tries to make you forget details of a traumatic experience. And a lot of people, they've buried it, and they just don't simply want to remember. They want to talk about their current situation. So it's a lot of hard work to find the people who are in a position to tell you a story that will allow you to vividly bring a reader to the scene. I had a similar kind of constraint. This week I've been reporting on the nerve gas attack in Great Britain. You may have heard about this. This very toxic nerve agent was used to poison a former Russian spy in Great Britain. And it's really, you know, scientifically it's very interesting because this type of nerve agent has never been used before. It was created by the Soviet Union in a secret program. And suddenly it emerges today, or this month, in the UK as an assassination tool. So for me, you know, this is a great story, but how to tell it, how to get information, what kind of scientific information is interesting. I spent last week trying to contact people. I'm contacting a lot of people. Many government scientists can't talk because in the US, this type of nerve agent, it's a classified topic. So they couldn't even help me tell me whether something that's publicly known about it was true. So there's some information on the web about it. And I asked them, can you at least confirm whether this is true? And they said, no, we can't discuss it at all. And these are scientists actually who were really cooperative with me on the Iran story, because the nerve agents and the chemical weapons used in Iran, everything's out in the public about that. There's really nothing secret anymore about that. But this nerve agent that was used in Great Britain earlier this month, this is something that was top secret. And so it was a real challenge as a journalist to gather information, to report. So again, I was of two minds as I'm reporting this. Part of me is like, this got my journalistic juices flowing. I'm like, wow, there's something here. I've got to get to the bottom of this. And so it was a challenge. It's like, how am I going to get a good information for the story? Who am I going to talk to? Okay, government scientists are not talking. I can talk to university scientists because they're not subject to, they don't have access to the classified information. So they can react to what's publicly known about this. And so that was my angle into the story. And, but it was a lot of work. I'm like trying to find some scientists who are able to talk, and most of my good sources are not available. Like, oh no, I'm trying to scramble. It's Tuesday, it's Wednesday, it's Thursday, it's Friday. My deadline's coming up. I have to finish the story by Monday. So basically, end of day Friday, I've got to call it. I said, this is what I've got. And then I have to decide to structure the story. And on top of that, I was coming to see you guys. So I was flying down here from Washington on Sunday afternoon. And so I'm like, okay, I've been planning to come down to talk here for a long time. I'm going to do that. That's not going to be sacrificed. But I've got to work writing the story around my schedule here. So I get down here Sunday night, I've got all my reporting notes, and I've got this blank screen in front of me. I'm like, oh, man, okay, I got to start writing. So I wrote the story. I mean, even for someone in the business as long as I have, as long as I've been, a blank screen is pretty intimidating. But I had all the information. That's a big difference. A lot of young writers, journalists, or any kind of writing, actually, not limited to journalism. A lot of the times, the limiting factor is that you have not gathered enough information to actually say what you want to say. And that's the only kind of advantage my experience brings to me after many years as a journalist, is I kind of know what kind of information I need to tell a certain kind of story. So I knew I had the information. I just had to go about writing it. And so once things got going, I was able to finish the story by midnight, and it appeared online yesterday, 4 p.m. And maybe after I finish with the Iranian part of the talk, I'll show it. If time permits, I'll talk a little bit about that story a little bit more. But back to Iran, which I really got sidetracked here. Another thing about Iran that a lot of people don't know is that it's an Islamic country. I mean, there's no separation basically between church and state, so to speak, mosque and state. And so it's subject to pretty strict Islamic rules in the country. And one rule is that women have to cover their head with a scarf. It's not nearly as kind of restrictive as Saudi Arabia, for example, or some sects where women have to completely cover themselves. But women have to cover their hair. That said, surprisingly, there are more women than men working as scientists in Iran. Because you might naturally associate the fact that women have to cover their hair with an assumption that they are strictly housewives. You might think that if you don't know anything about Iran. But apart from the kind of religious strictures about how women present themselves in public, apart from that, women are very active in the workforce. And like I say, more of them work in science than men. When I visited laboratories for the story, it was mostly women working in the labs. And here in the center, this is one of the laboratories where they were studying the victims of the nerve agents. So in that respect, women enjoy equality with men. despite the fact that they are subjected to these other regulations. This guy on the right, there's a museum in Tehran dedicated to the chemical weapons attacks, and he was one of the victims of chemical weapons, and he was explaining what they went through, and this was a shell from one of the chemical weapons attacks on a village. This poor guy, he's had numerous cataract surgeries because of exposures to the chemicals. He has lung problems. A lot of these people have persistent lung problems. It's a pretty devastating condition to have to suffer through. So I was in Iran for the 1 week in October. I came back, and I had this picture of what the victims had gone through, what people like Ahmadi, how it changed them. So I had a lot of the personal story was there. I had what's called anecdotes to tell that would help me tell the story, but I still needed to dive into the science and get more deep into the science. I had information that they provided me about the health effects that the victims had suffered, but it was the information they provided me. I still had to vet that information. I had to go to experts outside Iran and see how that corresponded to their understanding of the science. So the work did not end when I came back from this trip to Iran, the intensive reporting of that week. I called American experts, other experts, to get their commentary and to put it in context, what I learned, what was the meaning of the findings. And then I produced the story, which ran in early January. So I'm going to end there with Iran, but there's a little bit of time, and I want to just show you, I think we have a live connection here. I want to show you the article that I prepared on the nerve agent attacks in UK. I'm just going to go to our website. And then I want to leave time for some questions, because I think we have until 12:15 in the room here. I want to give you adequate time to ask me questions. So just hold on one sec. I'll call up the story. That is not my story. Okay, so here's the story, and so I'll just make a couple comments about it. This was already in the public consciousness. So if you read daily news, whatever news source, Washington Post, New York Times, any newspaper, they've already had coverage of this. So I had to write what's called a second-day story. In the business, we call it a second-day story. It's not breaking news. Breaking news was when this first happened, when it was first reported, or when an earthquake happens and there's a report, U.S. Geological Survey says there's a 6.4 earthquake, wherever. That's breaking news. Anything that comes subsequently is called a second-day story, no matter if it's a week later or a month later. So I had to do a second-day story that was specific for our readership. So that was another challenge. I write for Science magazine. Our readers are not the general public for the most part. They're scientists. So I had to have a scientific angle to the story. So in the very first paragraph, after the first sentence, which just reminds readers what this is about, I had to give the scientific angle, and which was that the scientists are trying to understand this mysterious nerve agent, and from what little public information is known, it was becoming clear that it would be hard to find an antidote against it, which is pretty important because the people exposed to it had not died. They were still sick, but they were gravely sick, and evidently the antidotes that are customary for nerve agents were not working. And that another aspect was that it could cause long-lasting health effects, which is unusual for nerve agents. So that was the scientific angle I developed after talking to so many scientists. I give some of the background. This quote here in this paragraph was it's kind of the gripping quote that allows you to finish the introduction to a story and then start getting into the background of a story. And it was particularly resonant for a scientific readership, because this is a scientist himself who happens to work with nerve agents. And he says that even for an experienced chemist, you could get yourself killed trying to make this kind of nerve agent, which is a pretty impressive statement, because you know that scientists don't mind working with hazardous chemicals. They do that all the time, and they have laboratory hoods and so forth, and there's a huge safety culture in the US. It's a scandal if someone gets sick working with a chemical. It so rarely happens. But here, the stuff is so dangerous that even experienced chemists like this guy could die trying to make this nerve agent. But I give a lot of details about, why this is so dangerous and what's unique about it. And then another new aspect that I could give to our readers was this. Oop, I'm sorry. I stepped on the cord. See if it comes back up in a second here. That was a model of the nerve agent interacting with the enzyme. And you saw this big yellow blob, which was the enzyme, and this little ball and stick molecule, which was the nerve agent. It kind of looks like a little rowboat next to like a cruise ship. It's a tiny little molecule compared to the enzyme. And the models were showing how it inserted deep inside the enzyme and basically took it out of commission that way. It would latch onto the enzyme and it couldn't be pried out. And that was what was unique about this nerve agent. So I'm sorry about that, but the good news is that was the last thing I wanted to show you. So you don't have to look at the screen anymore. I think I'm going to stop here, give you some time to ask some questions. So thank you very much for your attention. Yes? Okay, so in the Iran-Iraq War, the question was, aside from mustard gas, what else was used as a chemical agent? And it was nerve agents. So sarin, taboon. Taboon was the first nerve agent ever made. It's an interesting story. German chemists, just before World War II, made these nerve agents. They're basically pesticides that are so toxic that they can't be used as pesticides. And taboon was the first one, and it's called taboon because it's from the German word for taboo, basically. It's like, this is forbidden. And so it was used, sarin was used. Last year, you may recall, North Korean agents assassinated the brother of the leader, Kim Jong-un, at Kuala Lumpur airport. And they used a different nerve agent called VX, which was considered the most dangerous, the deadliest nerve agent ever created until this other Russian nerve agent it turns out it's several times more toxic than VX. There's other chemical weapons that were used in World War I a long time ago, and presumably countries have stockpiled those chemical weapons. Yes? Sorry? Flight to North Korea. So how do you get to North Korea? Okay, well, for Americans, it's easiest to go through Beijing. And the reason is that there's no North Korean embassy in America, so we have to get our visa in Beijing at their embassy in China. And then there's a direct flight from Beijing to Pyongyang on the North Korean airline, which uses these old kind of Soviet airplanes that are pretty decrepit. So it's kind of that's a big part of the adventure, actually. Yes?
What
Okay, so this trip, I'm reporting on astronomy. They have an astronomy observatory, and they have a new collaboration between North Korean astronomers and astronomers in Europe. So that's the primary reason I was invited. But I'll also do some reporting on the nuclear program and in advance of the summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. Yes?
So you said you've gone to North Korea about 6 times now? Or
Yeah.
you're going to 7?
This will be 7th, yeah.
Has it become easier for you to actually go to North Korea each time?
Well, that's a good question. The question is it easier for me to go to North Korea now because I've been several times before? And in one sense, yes, because they know me. So they know my background. They don't have to kind of evaluate me or investigate my background before giving me a visa. So in that sense, I'm a known person. Compared to my first time I went, it took 2 years for me to actually get a visa because they had to, check what I'd written before and so forth. On the other hand, I've written several stories from North Korea, and some of them have not been, well received by the North Korean regime, especially when I wrote about tuberculosis in North Korea, which indicated that they really mishandled the problem and they needed outside help to get their tuberculosis problem under control. So the North Korean government was pretty unhappy that they looked bad because of that. And that was the last story that I wrote in 2013. And I tried to get a visa a couple times after that, and I failed. And they told me it's because of the TB article. Sorry, you're on a blacklist right now. And they said, maybe in a few years it'll be okay. And so that was almost 5 years ago, and I finally got a visa again. So I guess over time, they couldn't challenge the article factually. They just didn't like the perception that it created. So that made it a little bit easier for me, because if I had got something terribly wrong or was insulting in some way, then maybe I would never get a visa again. But it was more just the fact that the factual situation on the ground didn't put them in a good light. But at the same time, it probably did help get more assistance for them to deal with the problem. So in the end, it was probably beneficial for the North Korean people. And I think that's why, over time, I was able to get a visa again. Yes?
Rich, could you mention to them about your experiences in North Korea in terms of the isolation and the lack of news and cell phones, Wi-Fi?
Yeah. So I love going to places like Iran because culturally it's fantastic, the food is great, and people are wonderful. Iranians are wonderful people. Going to North Korea is very stressful because technically we're still in a state of war with North Korea. And there's so much propaganda toward Americans, how evil America is. You see so many propaganda billboards on the streets, like American soldiers with a bayonet killing North Korean babies, that sort of thing. Or you see, on the other hand, missiles falling on the Capitol in Washington, D.C. and destroying the Capitol. So you have all this kind of propaganda. And it's inculcated from a very young age there. So they grow up believing America is the archenemy. And it's kind of part of their soul, basically. So going there as an American, of course they don't trust you. And the best I can have is a very business-like, cordial relationship with them. And it's actually a little easier with scientists because scientists often have a very similar mindset. And a lot of scientists in North Korea think like scientists in other countries. And so there's this kinship at that level. But you can never get past the fact that you're an American. So it's very stressful being there, first of all. But then on top of that, you have no internet access. My cell phone doesn't work in North Korea. It doesn't connect to a local network. The news channel is like the state TV, the North Korean TV. I don't speak Korean. Don't read Korean. So it's pretty isolating. And I was in North Korea when I visited a volcano there in 2011. I was there for 10 days. And it was a long time, but that time I was with a group of scientists, Western scientists. So we had some, we could eat together, we could hang out together, pass the time. But this trip, for example, I'm going myself. So I'm going to be the only American, and I'll be completely isolated for the 4 days. And it's going to be a drag. A lot of times it's going to be a drag. But it's still worth it to go to report the story, and it's actually a pretty good time to go to North Korea because of the summit that's going to happen. They don't want anything to happen to an American citizen before the summit. So I don't have any fear I'm going to be arrested or anything like that. But I just know I'll be very happy when I get back on the plane and come back out of North Korea, able to reconnect with the outside world. It's a little bit like time traveling when you go there. It's like going back in time 50 years. And so that's actually part of the interesting part of the experience, being a journalist, going to really like Terra Nova. I mean, this is where few journalists go, and when journalists go, they usually go there as part of a package tour, and they're exposed to only what the government wants them to see. Whereas I'm going as an individual journalist, I'm going working with the scientists themselves, so I have a lot more kind of exclusive access and information. So it's worth kind of the hassle of going there, I feel. Oh, I should also add that the State Department now bans U.S. citizens from traveling to North Korea. They put a travel ban in place starting September 1st last year. So I had to get special permission from our government to go. I had to make a special petition, and then I got a passport, a second passport specifically for this trip. And it's stamped in the passport, valid for one round trip to North Korea, which is good it's a round trip, because I wouldn't want it to be a one-way. But I can only use it for this trip. It's only valid for 1 year. And then if I want to go back again to North Korea, I have to get a separate passport for that. Yes?
Your job is pretty like expensive, and it seems like it takes a lot of you away from like the family. Like, how do you deal with like seeing them and things like that?
Yeah. Well, so my family's kind of used to me going to these weird places now, fortunately. The first time I went to North Korea in 2004, they thought I was crazy and that I wouldn't come back. But now they're kind of used to it. And I don't travel so much. So my job is really to edit stories most of the time. I'm editing stories that other writers are writing. So I work in Washington, D.C. And we have writers all over the world. And they send stories in to Washington to another colleague or myself, and we edit them and put them into the magazine. So I write pretty sparingly. But fortunately, I get to write about areas that my colleagues don't want to write about. So I'm the only person on the staff who really wants to go to Iran and North Korea. So it's exclusively my beat, so to speak. But I don't travel too much. So I'll take a trip like this maybe 2 or 3 times a year, this big overseas trip. Then sometimes I'll come on domestic trips to Winston-Salem or to other places and give talks or whatever. But these big reporting trips are pretty infrequent for me now, which my family's happy about. Yes? Very, very few. So as a science journalist, I'm lucky in the sense that most scientists speak English. Almost anywhere I go. Iran, almost all the scientists speak English. I rarely need a translator. North Korea is an exception. North Korea, I don't know if any scientists actually speak English. They're so isolated there. So I have a government translator assigned to me. I cannot bring my own translator. And so that means, of course, the conversation is quite restricted because the scientists are not going to say something that's going to get them in trouble. So it's quite frustrating in that sense because you never really know what the scientists think. Yeah, so it's pretty unusual in that respect. The first trip I made in 2004 to North Korea, I knew that a lot of the older scientists had studied in Soviet Union, in Russia, because North Korea and Russia were friends for a long time. And so I met some older scientists on the first day, older North Korean scientists, the first day I was there. And I started chatting with them in Russian, because I studied Russian in university. And then the minder just immediately stopped the conversation, because he didn't speak Russian. So he didn't know what we were talking about. We weren't talking about anything interesting, because we had just started chatting. But he immediately stopped it. And none of the North Korean scientists could speak to me in Russian, because they didn't have a translator able to monitor the conversation that way. So everybody had to be forced to speak in Korean, translate in English, and back and forth that way. But that's unusual. Most of the time, scientists, it's a global scientific community, and English is the language of science. So most of the people I talk to speak pretty good English. Yes?
What initially got you into journalism?
Oh, that's a good question. In fact, I've talking to some of the journalism and writing classes here, I've told them, my personal story, which was I wanted to go into science initially. I studied biology. I went to graduate school for biology, but in the first year of graduate school, decided lab work wasn't for me. I really hated being cooped up in a lab, and a lot of times experiments don't work. So 90% of the time, you're just frustrated because something's not working. You have to do something else to try to get it to work. And it just wasn't suited to my personality. And I found a science communication program, which basically my interest and curiosity about science, I could continue to maintain that, but I wouldn't actually have to do science. I could instead either write about it, or some students in the program, they go on to write exhibits in museums or become public information officer for a university, writing press releases about what the scientists do. So there are different tracks that students would go into. But I found it was much more suited to me, because I could, as a journalist, I could really study intensely a topic for a few weeks or whatever, talk to the experts, almost become like an expert myself for a short period of time, finish the project, then move on to the next topic. So I wasn't stuck doing the same research in the same topic my whole career. I could dabble in different fields that way. And it was like being in university, which is kind of nice, because you're just learning all the time, but getting paid for it instead of having to pay university. And so it was really kind of the right career direction for me personally. And the program that I went to in California, it's still going. It's still, it's still taking former scientists, like aspiring scientists who decide they don't want to do it, and retraining them as communicators. And 20 years later, it's still doing that.
All right. I think we're about out of time, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Okay.
Remember, if you're in my class, if you didn't sign in ahead of time, be sure to stay afterwards and do that. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Rich, for being here. We certainly enjoyed it, and I hope you had a good time.
I did. Thank you all.